frontline battleships that had been pursuing Bismarck from the west. The largest and most powerful warship yet commissioned had been rendered a sitting duck by a single aircraft. On the morning of Tuesday, 27 May 1941, Rodney and King George V drew closer to Bismarck. The Bismarck was well illuminated by the rising morning sun in the background. Rodney steered to the north so that its gunfire would work the length of the Bismarck. King George V took the side. They opened fire just before 0900. Bismarck returned fire, but her inability to steer and her list to port severely affected her shooting capability. Her low speed of 7 knots also made her an easy target. She was soon hit several times. The heavy cruisers Norfolk and Dorsetshire added their firepower. One salvo destroyed the forward control post, killing most of the senior officers. Within half an hour, Bismarck's guns were all but silent, and she was even lower in the water. Rodney closed to point-blank range to strike the superstructure, while King George V fired from further out. Bismarck continued to fly its ensign. With no sign of surrender, and despite the unequal struggle, the British attack continued. With their fuel and shell supplies low, Dorsetshire launched 4 torpedoes, which probably hit the Bismarck at short range. Aboard the Bismarck, rather than risk her being captured, the order was given to scuttle her and abandon ship. Only 110 Bismarck sailors were left to abandon ship. Almost 2,100 German sailors had lost their lives. After the sinking, Admiral John Tovey of the Royal Navy said that the Bismarck had put up a most gallant fight against impossible odds, worthy of the old days of the Imperial German Navy, and she went down with her colors flying. After an initial burst of activity, the Atlantic campaign now quieted down. Dönitz had planned a maximum submarine effort for the first month of the war, with almost all the available U-boats out on patrol in September. That level of operations could not be sustained, as the boats needed to return to harbor to refuel, restock, and refit. The German occupation of Norway in April 1940, followed by the rapid conquest of the Low Countries and France in May and June, transformed the war at sea. The French bases at Brest, Lorient, La Pallice, and La Rochelle were about 450 miles closer to the Atlantic than the German bases on the North Sea. The U-boats no longer had to sail around the British Isles to reach the most profitable hunting grounds. This enabled them to attack convoys further to the west and let them spend longer time on patrol. Early U-boat operations from the French bases were spectacularly successful. This was the heyday of the great U-boat aces. The U-boat crews became heroes at home in Germany and referred to this as the happy time. From July until October 1940, over 220 Allied ships were sunk. The biggest challenge for the U-boats was to find the convoys in the vastness of the ocean. The Germans had a handful of very long-range Focke-Wulf 200 Condor aircraft based at Bordeaux and Stavanger, which were used for reconnaissance. But the primary source of convoy sightings was the U-boats themselves. Instead of attacking the Allied convoys singly, the German U-boats began to work in packs, coordinated centrally by radio. When one boat sighted a convoy, it would report the sighting to U-boat headquarters. It would then follow the convoy and wait for other boats to join up before attacking. The attacks were usually at night. So, instead of being faced by a single submarine, the convoy escorts had to cope with a group of perhaps half a dozen U-boats, attacking in a single night. The most daring commanders, like Otto Kretschmer, not only penetrated the convoy's escort screen, but attacked from within the columns of merchantmen in the convoy. The escort vessels, which were too few in number and often lacking in endurance, had no answer to the lone submarine attacking on the surface at night. Their hydrophone or ASDIC detection apparatus only worked against underwater targets. Wolfpack tactics were first used successfully by the Germans in September and October 1940. They had a devastating effect in a series of convoy battles. On 21 September, convoy HX-72, composed of 42 merchantmen, was attacked by a pack of 4 U-boats. 11 ships were sunk, and 2 were damaged over 2 nights. In October, SC-7, with a weak escort of 2 sloops and 2 corvettes, was overwhelmed and lost 59% of its ships. The battle with HX-79 in the following days was in many ways worse for the escorts than that with SC-7. The loss of a quarter of the convoy, despite a strong escort of 2 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 3 trawlers, and a minesweeper, demonstrated the inadequacy of the British anti-submarine technology at the time. Finally, on 1 December, 7 German U-boats and 3 Italian submarines caught convoy HX-90 and sank 10 ships while damaging 3 others. The success of pack tactics against these convoys encouraged Admiral Dönitz to adopt the Wolfpack as his standard tactic. The U-boats were not the only threat to the convoys. Following some early experience in support of the war at sea during the Norwegian campaign, the Luftwaffe contributed small numbers of aircraft to the Battle of the Atlantic from 1940 onward. These were primarily long-range reconnaissance planes, first with Focke-Wulf 200 and later Junkers 290 maritime patrol aircraft. At first, the Focke-Wulf aircraft were very successful, claiming 365,000 tons of shipping in early 1941. The disastrous convoy battles of October 1940 forced a change in British tactics. The most important of these was the introduction of permanent escort groups to improve the coordination and effectiveness of ships and men in battle. Allied efforts were helped by a gradual increase in the number of escort vessels available. At a tactical level, new shortwave radar sets that could detect surfaced U-boats and were suitable for both small ships and aircraft began to arrive during 1941. The impact of these changes first began to be felt in the convoy battles during the spring of 1941. In early March, Gunther Prien in U-47 failed to return from patrol. 2 weeks later, in the Battle of Convoy HX-112, the newly formed 3rd Escort Group of 5 destroyers and 2 corvettes held off a U-boat pack. U-100 was detected by the primitive radar on the destroyer Vanok, rammed and sunk. Shortly afterward, the U-99 was also caught and sunk, its crew captured. Dönitz had lost his 3 leading aces, Kretschmer, Prien, and Schepke. Dönitz then moved his Wolfpacks further west in order to catch the convoys before the anti-submarine escort joined them. This new strategy was rewarded at the beginning of April when the pack found convoy SC-26 before its anti-submarine escort had joined. 10 ships were sunk. However, another U-boat was lost. A major factor in the success of the British during the second half of 1941 and throughout the rest of the campaign was the cracking of the German naval Enigma machine cipher. The Wolfpack tactics relied on radio communications, based on the assumption that the Enigma cipher could not be broken, and that short signal messages could not be pinpointed with enough accuracy to endanger the signaling U-boat. Both assumptions were wrong. On 9 May, the British destroyer HMS Bulldog captured U-110 and recovered a complete, intact Enigma machine. Combined with a couple of other captures, this was a vital breakthrough for the Allied code-breaking efforts. This gave Britain the ability to read German naval signals for much of the remainder of the campaign. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1941, a combination of reading Enigma messages and radio direction finding enabled the British to plot the positions of the U-boat patrol lines, allowing the convoys to be routed to evade them. But this was offset by the growing number of U-boats coming into service. The German Type 7C submarine started reaching the Atlantic in large numbers in 1941. Eventually, 585 of them would be delivered. Although the Allies generally succeeded in defending the convoys through the summer and autumn of 1941, they were not sinking U-boats in anything like sufficient numbers. In October 1941, Hitler ordered Dönitz to move many of the U-boats into the Mediterranean to support German operations in that theater. The resulting concentration near Gibraltar resulted in a series of battles around the Gibraltar and Sierra Leone convoys. In December 1941, convoy HG-76 sailed, escorted by the 36th Escort Group of 2 sloops and 6 corvettes under Captain Frederick John Walker. It was reinforced by the first of the new escort carriers, HMS Audacity, and 3 destroyers from Gibraltar. The convoy was immediately intercepted by the waiting U-boat pack, resulting in a brutal battle. Walker was a tactical innovator. His ships were highly trained, and the presence of an escort carrier meant that the U-boats were frequently sighted and forced to dive before they could get close to the convoy. Over the next 5 days, 5 U-boats were sunk, despite the loss of the Audacity after 2 days. The British lost the Audacity and a destroyer, but just 2 merchant ships. The battle was the first clear Allied convoy victory in the campaign. Through dogged effort, the Allies slowly gained the upper hand through the end of 1941. Although Allied warships failed to sink U-boats in large numbers, most convoys evaded attack completely. Shipping losses were high, but manageable. By 1941, the United States was taking an increasing part in the war, despite its nominal neutrality. In April 1941, President Roosevelt extended the Pan-American Security Zone to the east, almost as far as Iceland. British forces had occupied Iceland when Denmark fell to the Germans in 1940. The U.S. was persuaded to provide forces to relieve British troops on the island. American warships began escorting Allied convoys in the western Atlantic as far as Iceland, and had several hostile encounters with U-boats. The attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent German declaration of war on the United States had an immediate effect on the campaign. Dönitz promptly planned an attack on shipping off the American East Coast. But Dönitz had only 12 boats of the Type 9 class that were able to make the long trip to the U.S. East Coast. Half of those had been removed, by Hitler's order, to counter British forces in the Mediterranean. One of the remainder was under repair, which left only 5 boats to set out for the U.S. on the so-called Operation Paukenschlag, or drumbeat. The U.S., having no direct experience of modern naval war on its own shores, did not employ shoreside blackouts. The U-boats simply stood off the shore of the eastern seaboard and picked off ships as they were silhouetted against the lights of the cities. Worse, the U.S. Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet, Admiral Ernest King, who hated the British, initially rejected the Royal Navy's calls for a coastal blackout or a convoy system. Merchant ships sailing in U.S. waters were left exposed and suffered greatly. The first U-boats started shooting on 13 January 1942, and by the time they left for France on 6 February, they had sunk 156,939 tons of shipping without loss. After 6 months of this, the statistics were grim. The first batch of Type 9s had been replaced by Type 7s. The Type 9s would refuel at sea from Type 14 milk cow tankers. Between the two types, 397 ships, totaling over 2 million tons, were sunk. In May, King instituted a coastal convoy system. This quickly led to the loss of 7 U-boats. But the U.S. did not have enough ships to cover all the holes. The U-boats continued to operate freely in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, where they effectively closed several U.S. ports until July, when British escorts began arriving. The institution of an interlocking convoy system on the American coast and in the Caribbean Sea in mid-1942 resulted in an immediate drop in attacks in those areas. Attention shifted back to the Atlantic convoys. For the Allies, the situation was serious, but not critical, throughout much of 1942. The initial success of Operation Drumbeat had one unexpected effect. It was so successful that Dönitz's policy of economic war was seen even by Hitler to be the only effective use of the U-boat, and he was given complete command to use them as he saw fit. Meanwhile, Dönitz's commander Raeder was dismissed as a result of a disastrous Battle of the Barents Sea, in which 2 German cruisers were beaten off by half a dozen Royal Navy destroyers. Dönitz was eventually made Grand Admiral of the fleet, and all building priorities turned to U-boats.
Scans the horizon for the convoy. Interception is perfect.
Prepare to submerge!
Around the convoy, giving each skipper his own share of the spoils. No ship is safe.
With the U.S. quickly arranging convoys, ship losses to the U-boats quickly dropped, and Dönitz realized his boats could be better used elsewhere. On 19 July 1942, he ordered the last U-boats to withdraw from the United States Atlantic coast, and by the end of July 1942, he shifted his attention back to the North Atlantic, where the battle would enter its final terrible phase. By this point, there were enough U-boats spread across the Atlantic to allow several wolf packs to attack several different convoy routes. Often as many as 10 to 15 boats would attack in 1 or 2 waves, following the convoys by day and attacking at night. Losses quickly increased, and in October, 56 ships of over 258,000 tons were sunk in the air gap between Greenland and Iceland. On 19 November 1942, British Admiral Noble was replaced as Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches Command by Admiral Sir Max Horton. Horton used the growing number of escorts that were becoming available to Western Approaches Command to organize support groups that were used to reinforce convoys that came under attack. Unlike the regular escort groups, the support groups were not directly responsible for the safety of any particular convoy. This lack of responsibility gave them much greater tactical flexibility and allowed the support groups to detach ships to hunt submarines which were spotted by reconnaissance or picked up by high-frequency direction finding, or huff-duff. In situations where the regular escorts would have had to return to their convoy, the support groups were able to persist in hunting a submarine for many hours. One tactic used by British captains was to sit on top of a U-boat and wait until its air ran out, and it was forced to the surface. The winter weather provided a short respite from the fighting in January and February 1943. But from the end of February onward, fortified by a U-boat operational strength nearing its zenith and a breakdown in Allied ultra-intelligence during the first 3 weeks of March, German submarines again began to enjoy great success in the mid-Atlantic gap, where Allied air cover still did not reach. There were so many U-boats on patrol in the North Atlantic that it was difficult for the convoys to evade detection, resulting in a succession of vicious convoy battles. Over the next 20 days, the wolf packs, which now had a strength of 100 in the North and Central Atlantic, wrought such havoc that Allied losses again began to reach the devastating levels of 1942. One of the biggest engagements of the war took place between 16 and 20 March, when 20 U-boats attacked 2 eastbound convoys totaling 100 ships. At the cost of only 1 U-boat, the Germans sank 21 ships, with a combined 141,000 tonnage. The overall figure for March in the North Atlantic was 476,349 tons, about 75% of the world total, with 82 of the 108 ships lost in this theater. Most serious of all was that nearly 2/3 of these losses had been sunk while sailing in convoy. The Admiralty considered that this was the closest the Germans ever came to breaking the transatlantic lifeline between Britain and America. However, this possibility was only a fleeting one, as over the next 2 months, the German offensive faltered rapidly. The foundation of the change in fortunes had been laid in January, when the British and U.S. leaders conferred at the Casablanca Conference. Churchill and Roosevelt decided that the defeat of the U-boat must become the Allies' top priority. The liberation of Europe would never be able to happen until the Battle of the Atlantic had been won. The supply situation in Britain was such that there was talk of being unable to continue the war effort, with supplies of fuel being particularly low. It appeared that Dönitz was winning the war, and yet the next 2 months saw a complete reversal of fortunes. The turning point came in April 1943, when a convoy of 43 merchantmen, escorted by 2 destroyers, a frigate, and corvettes, was attacked by a pack of 30 U-boats. Although 13 merchant ships were sunk, the U-boats were detected by Huff-Duff sonar. 6 U-boats were sunk by the escorts or Allied aircraft, and the merchantmen reached the protection of land-based air cover, causing Admiral Dönitz to call off the attack. In April, losses of U-boats shot up, while their kills of ships fell dramatically. By May, the Wolfpack was no longer. The Germans had lost the technological race. Over the next 2 years, large numbers of U-boats were sunk, usually with all hands, since an attacking aircraft was incapable of rescuing any survivors, and a depth-charged submarine would sink immediately. There was no single reason for this, but a number of advances that took effect at almost the same time. What had changed was a sudden convergence of technologies, combined with an increase in Allied resources. The large gap in the middle of the Atlantic that had been unreachable by aircraft was closed by long-range B-24 Liberator aircraft. By spring 1943, the British had developed an effective sea-scanning centimetric radar, small enough to be carried on patrol aircraft armed with airborne depth charges. Further air cover was provided by the introduction of growing numbers of American-built escort carriers, and later the merchant aircraft carrier, or MAC ship. Flying Grumman Wildcats primarily, they sailed in the convoys and provided the much-needed air cover and patrols all the way across the Atlantic. Finally, larger numbers of escorts became available, both as a result of American building programs and the release of escorts that had been tied up in the North African landings during November and December 1942. With convoys securely protected, there were enough resources to allow escort carrier groups to aggressively hunt U-boats. Above all, the breaking of the German naval enigma enabled the Allied convoys to evade the Wolfpacks, while British support groups and American hunter-killer groups were able to hunt U-boats that approached the convoys or whose positions were revealed by Enigma decrypts. Allied air forces developed tactics and technology to make the Bay of Biscay, the main route for French-based U-boats, very dangerous. The introduction of the Lee Light enabled accurate attacks on U-boats that were recharging their batteries on the surface at night. Victory was achieved at a huge cost. Between 1939 and 1945, 3,500 Allied ships were sunk with a gross tonnage of 14.5 million at a cost of 783 German U-boats.
It was the pride of the German Navy, and at the time of its launching in 1938, the largest battleship in the world. On that day, Adolf Hitler himself had come to salute it.
From a German newsreel of the time, we hear the voice of Frau von Hassel, daughter of Admiral Tirpitz, christening the last and most formidable of Germany's battleships.
Befehl des Führers und obersten Befehlshabers der Wehrmacht taufe ich dich auf den Namen Tirpitz.
Six years later, the 35,000-ton Tirpitz would lie trapped in a Norwegian fjord, while RAF dive bombers were revving up for the kill.
Tirpitz was the sister ship of Bismarck. Launched 1 April 1939, she was to be deployed in a manner similar to Bismarck, as a commerce raider to be sent against Allied merchant shipping in the North Atlantic. Her role as a lone hunter earned her the nickname Lonely Queen of the North by the Norwegians. Following the inception of the Arctic convoys, Tirpitz was sent to northern Norwegian waters, where she spent most of World War II in the fjords. She made 3 offensive sorties: an attempt to interdict convoy PQ-12 in March 1942, Operation Sportsballast. A similar attempt against PQ-17 in July 1942, Operation Russelsprung, and a raid on Spitzbergen in September 1943, Operation Sicilien. She acted mainly as a fleet in being, tying up Royal Navy resources, and Britain decided to sink her while she was in port. Several separate operations were needed to achieve this objective. The first attempt to destroy Tirpitz was a very risky operation. As part of Operation Source, British X-class midget submarines planted explosive charges beneath Tirpitz in September 1943. The submarines had to travel at least 1,000 miles from base, negotiate a minefield, dodge nets, gun defenses, and enemy listening posts. Having eluded all these hazards, they finally placed the 4-ton Amatal side charges underneath the ship. These detonated an hour later, doing so much damage that Tirpitz was put out of action for several months.
Although this curious-looking craft was used in the final destruction of the Tirpitz, it was one of the war's least publicized successes. For years, the Navy had kept it top secret. It was the X-craft, a midget submarine that could sneak past any enemy defenses. When the War Office decided it was time to come clean, Pathé News was allowed to film the secrets of the X-craft.
Below the hatch is a diving chamber, which can be flooded or pumped dry as required. A chamber just large enough to pass a diver and a limpet mine for an attack on an enemy ship. This is the scene in the control room as the craft is about to dive. Under favorable conditions, she can forge ahead at 6.5 knots, submerged. And so, under the surface, she slides. A pygmy with the punch of a giant, with an ensign which is never struck when on operational patrol. The cramped space allows for only a minimum of navigational aids to be used, but the craft has to be conned under conditions which demand the highest degree of accuracy for hours on end. Watch her as she surfaces. She is less than 6 feet across and 13 feet shorter than a cricket pitch in length. Yet, it was in craft of this type that men of this breed pierced the defenses of Alten Fjord and fixed their limpet mines to the hull of the Tirpitz.
By April 1944, Tirpitz had been repaired and posed a renewed threat. In response, the British executed Operation Tungsten, an attack by carrier-borne aircraft of the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm. A significant part of the home fleet took part, including 2 battleships, 2 fleet aircraft carriers, 5 escort aircraft carriers, 2 cruisers, and 16 destroyers, with support from 2 oilers. The air attack was launched on 2 April, a day earlier than planned, catching Tirpitz while she was preparing for departure on trials. The air attacks were in 2 waves of Ferry Barracuda torpedo bombers with escorting fighters. The defenses were poor and ill-organized, and the attack faced little effective opposition. Some of the fighters contributed by strafing the decks with machine gun fire. Tirpitz lost 122 crew, with a further 300 wounded, but damage was limited to the superstructure. However, the overall damage was significant and took 2 months to repair. The next carrier-borne attempt was Operation Mascot in July 1944. By this time, however, the Germans had set up effective warning and smoke systems, which effectively obscured Tirpitz from the attacking aircraft. Apart from 1 near miss, the raid was a failure. Tirpitz underwent sea trials in early August 1944, and 3 weeks later, the Fleet Air Arm launched more attacks. These had mixed success, none dealing the hoped-for coup de grace. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces proposed several schemes to attack Tirpitz using Mosquito fighter bombers, short Sunderland flying boats, or B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers, but none came to anything. There were 3 attempts by the RAF. The first attempt, Operation Paravan, was launched on 15 September by Avro Lancasters of the 6th, 17th, and 9th Squadrons from a temporary base at Yagodnik near Arkhangelsk in the Soviet Union. They were equipped with Barnes-Wallace's 5-ton tailboy bombs and experimental 5,000-pound Johnny Walker underwater walking mines. On that occasion, a smokescreen successfully protected Tirpitz from all but one of the bombs. However, that one bomb disabled the ship to the extent that she was no longer a threat to Allied shipping. A German report stated, "It was eventually decided at a conference on 23 September 1944, at which the Commander-in-Chief and Naval Staff were present, that it was no longer possible to make Tirpitz ready for sea and action again." However, this was kept secret from the British, who believed that repairs were possible, and so the attacks continued. In October, as Tirpitz was no longer considered to be a major warship, she was moved further south to Tromsø to act as a floating gun battery against the expected Allied invasion of Norway. She was now within range of air operations from Scotland. Tirpitz was finally sunk on 12 November 1944 by 6th, 17th, and 9th Squadron Lancasters with tailboy bombs on their third attempt. Tirpitz capsized within minutes of the attack, and close to 1,000 German sailors, out of the 1,700 aboard, died.
This is the death of the battleship Tirpitz. RAF Lancasters roared to the attack. And here is the 45,000-ton pride of the German Navy firing desperately at the air raiders. A 6-ton armor-piercing blockbuster is on its way. The Tirpitz is mortally hit, but replies with everything, including 15-inch guns, in this climactic battle of Tromsø Fjord in Norway. Another near hit. The RAF is scoring after 2 previous unsuccessful attempts from Scottish bases 1,200 miles away. Another blockbuster heads for the target. Perfect weather sweeps away the defensive smoke screens, and another hit is registered. These RAF pictures show the death agonies of the crippled monster. Months of preparation went into the assault. The RAF, in sinking the Tirpitz, turned in one of its greatest jobs.
The German Navy always classified Schornhorst and Gneisenau as Schlachtschiffe, or battleships. These two ships, considered handsome and fast, were invariably mentioned at the same time. They were fondly referred to as the Ugly Sisters because they prowled together and wrought havoc on British shipping. Both Scharnhorst and her sister were designed for an extended range to allow for commerce raiding. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau's first wartime operation was a sweep into the Iceland-Faroes Passage in late November 1939. They sank the British armed merchant cruiser HMS Rawalpindi. In the spring of 1940, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau covered the invasion of Norway. They engaged the British battlecruiser Renown on April 9, 1940, with no conclusive results. Together, they sank the British aircraft carrier HMS Glorious and her escorting destroyers Acasta and Ardent on 8 June off Norway. An unescorted convoy of tankers was attacked southeast of Newfoundland on 15 March, and the next day another mixed convoy was detected and attacked with the sinking of 13 ships, 4 by the Scharnhorst. This was the last engagement before the battlecruisers entered the French port of Brest on 22 March. The Scharnhorst sank 8 ships with total tonnage of 49,300 out of the squadron's total of 22 ships with a combined tonnage of 115,600. On Christmas Day 1943, Scharnhorst and several destroyers under the command of Konteradmiral Erik Bay put to sea with the purpose of attacking the Russia-bound Arctic convoys JW-55B and RA-55A north of Norway. Unfortunately for the Germans, their orders were decoded by the British codebreakers, and the Admiralty was able to direct their forces to intercept.